talk, is it okay if we take a selfie together? Okay, cool. The best way to take a selfie together is for all of you guys that are holding books in your hands to hold them up. And if you don't have a book, then just like make yourself look as excited and cool as possible. And this is going to take like 3 photographs because there's so many of you here. So are you ready? Okay, on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Just like, oh, we're doing, yeah! Okay, one more. Oh my gosh, yeah! Thank you! Thank you, National Book Festival. Thank you, Warren. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. This is so lovely. We're going to start my slideshow. So as soon as I can tell where it's being projected, I will start talking. There it is! Awesome! Okay, and I have a clicker. You can tell I've done this a few times, right? Because I'm like, what's happening? Okay, so my name is Raina, and I'm going to give you the pronunciation guide for my last name. It's Telgemeier, which rhymes with the name Helga and Tyre. So Helga, Tyre, Telgemeier. Yeah, it's tricky. It's German. So, those are some of my books. I am a graphic novelist, which is awesome. It's the coolest job in the world. And today I have 3 pieces of advice for all of you. And those pieces of advice are read books, talk to people, and share your story. So, let's start with the first one. Read books. Pretty simple, right? Books are something that I've liked to read since I was pretty young. This is a picture of me in 4th grade. And I'm smiling in this picture. I was kind of a shy kid. I didn't tend to raise my hand in class or put myself out there when something cool was going on. I was kind of just like in the corner. But I really did like to read books. And I got a lot of my books from the Scholastic Book Clubs and the Scholastic Book Fair. You can see in this slide there's like a Babysitter's Club book, and I got my Babysitter's Club books through the book fairs, the book clubs. And then in the middle there's a Calvin and Hobbes collection, and that was another thing that I loved to get from Scholastic, was the comic book collections of newspaper strips that I used to read. So one of my favorite comic strips is Calvin and Hobbes by Bill Watterson. And if you haven't read Calvin and Hobbes, it's about a boy named Calvin and his tiger, Hobbes. And these two have big imaginations and big adventures. And most of the adventures are in Calvin's imagination. So they go back in time, they hang out with dinosaurs, they go into space or the future. And so it's a lot of fun to read. It's really well drawn, so it's fun to look at. And the thing about Calvin, and the thing about a lot of kids, that with the big imagination comes sometimes the idea to imagine that something's wrong with yourself. So Calvin would sometimes experience anxiety. And in this comic strip, he is imagining that one night when he's very sick, that something might be really wrong with him, and that maybe he's going to die of his illness that he's suffering from. And then in the morning he feels better. But that's not unlike what I experienced as a kid, is that every time I didn't feel well, I would sometimes panic. And I would say that it made me feel less alone to see it in a comic strip and to read about a kid like Calvin who felt the same way. Yeah, this is the reality of my life. That smiling class portrait was part of it, but I also was subject to panic attacks and worrying that something was really wrong with me. I was also a big fan of Babysitter's Club books. And these were just the novels. They were just words on paper back before they existed as graphic novels. And what a cool thing that 20 years later I got to adapt and illustrate these books into comics. But back in those days, I was just interested in the characters and their stories. So this is one of the books in the early part of the series, The Truth About Stacy. And the truth about Stacy is that she's got diabetes. And that's an invisible illness. It's not something people can see when they look at her, but it does affect everything about her life. It affects the way she eats, it affects the way she talks to her friends, and the way she handles her own life. So seeing that in a book also gave me a lot of courage, because even though I didn't have diabetes, I did have another invisible illness called irritable bowel syndrome, or IBS. And what that means is you have a lot of stomach aches and you don't know why. And there's no medical reason for it. And this is something I started suffering from when I was in elementary school, and I still suffer from it to this day. And I'm proud to tell you that at this present moment, I do not have a stomach ache. So knock on wood, that is not the case. But it's something that I deal with, and it's something that's really hard to talk about. It's hard to say to somebody, you know what, I gotta get off stage right now because I gotta go to the bathroom. Or if you're in class and you need to leave class, or you need to like get out of the car or off the bus, like how are you supposed to handle that? And it's something that we just don't talk about that much. It's like a reason to feel embarrassed, but reading about another character that had something about themselves that they weren't sure how to talk about was super helpful for me. Speaking of comic strips, I've been a huge fan of Lynn Johnston's For Better or For Worse since I was a little kid. And the coolest thing about For Better or For Worse is that all of the characters started out young. I was about the same age as the kids in the strip, and then they aged in real time. So over the years, it's kind of like we grew up together. I felt like I had been friends with the Pattersons and their friends and their family for most of my life. So in this particular strip, Elizabeth, who's the daughter in the Patterson family, is getting teased by a classmate because her classmate got her ears pierced. And Lizzie really wants to get her ears pierced too, but she won't. Her parents won't let her. So she's feeling teased. She's feeling, belittled. And I could totally relate to that because I also had friends who gave me a hard time. And it's unclear why kids give each other a hard time so much, but we're all kind of reflecting what goes on in our minds and in our personal lives, and sometimes we take it out on each other. But I didn't understand it. All I know is that seeing it in media really helped me. And so after all of this, I was about 10 years old. I was a fan of comic strips, and my dad noticed that I was reading a lot of comics. And he handed me this book, which is called Barefoot Gen, subtitle, A Cartoon History of Hiroshima. Cool. So, parents probably know, and some of the kids might know, that Hiroshima is the very first city to ever have an atomic bomb dropped on it. And this is a true life story of a survivor of the bomb. So, you get to know the characters, Gen is the middle brother in the family, and you get to know him and his younger brother and his family, and his friends and his neighbors, and it's hard to read, but you still feel a lot of sympathy for these characters in this wartime setting. And so I'm reading a comic book, and I'm thinking, well, it's definitely going to have a happy ending. In the last chapter of this volume, the bomb falls, and half of the characters in the story die. And I was shocked, because I thought that comics were supposed to make you feel good. And it turns out comics can make you feel a lot of different things. So I was mad at my dad, because I felt like he had tricked me by giving me a comic about something so serious. But I was also really just mad at the world for being such a difficult place. But it kind of turned me into a little peace activist, I would say. And it's part of why I realized the power of comics and that they can tell just about any kind of story. So I also experienced a ton of empathy for these characters. Even though I've never lived through an atomic bombing, thank goodness, I hope none of us ever have to see that world, but it made me think of how awful it would have been to be in Gen's shoes. And so that also is the power of books, the power of reading, the power of putting yourself into somebody else's world and experiencing it through their eyes. So it's super important to read books because it can help you feel less alone. So, the next thing is talk to people, which sounds about as simple as reading books, right? Talk to people. Yeah, talk to anybody who's around you. Talk to your friends. Talk to your family. My Siri is asking me what I'm talking about right now, so I'm just going to turn my phone off. It asked me something about what song I was listening to, and I was like, what did I just say that triggered it? Talk to Siri. That's my advice. No, talk to people. Talk to your friends. Talk to your family. Talk to your teachers. Talk to everybody. Maybe it's just about comics. That's what I used to do. I used to talk about my favorite comics and my favorite cartoon shows, and I was not that big of a talker as a kid. I was kind of shy, like I said, and kind of nervous all the time, but when it came to talking about stuff I was passionate about, you couldn't shut me up. So that was good. But I had a really hard time talking about what was really going on inside. So my mom started to notice my anxiety and the tendency to kind of shut down when things were bothering me. What is it that you're so afraid of? Well, I had trouble in school. I got bad grades sometimes, and a lot of times when I would feel anxious about something, my stomach would hurt. But that's not what it was. What are you so afraid of? I also got bullied in school. I had a lot of classmates who I didn't get along with for whatever reason, and it made my days pretty stressful. But that wasn't the thing. What is it you're so afraid of? So now I'm going to talk about the thing that scares me most in life in front of 4,000 people, because that's a cool thing to do. I'm afraid of throwing up. That is my biggest fear. It's not snakes, even though I've talked about being afraid of snakes in my previous work. It's not even going to the orthodontist, which is another thing I've talked about in my previous work. It's being sick. For some reason, the idea of being sick scares me more than the thing itself. So the idea of throwing up is probably the worst thing that you could possibly do to me. So like, you know how sometimes you're in class and somebody goes, and like makes a noise? Like that would freak me out. And if somebody in my family was sick, I would freak out and leave the house. So, that's it. That's my biggest fear. And somehow just talking about it makes the fear seem a little bit smaller and a little bit less scary to me. And that's exactly what guts is about. And it's another cool double entendre, because guts is literally what's going on inside your belly, but it's also about finding the strength to face those fears and to face those anxieties and insecurities. So I do talk a lot about that stuff in my book. It's not too graphic, I don't think. But it does kind of put you into the experience of another person's panic attack. And it's not easy to depict what it feels like through words alone, but I have the value of, art and color and words and sound effects to try and convey how it feels to be so scared. And one of the things you feel is extremely isolated. You feel so alone. You feel like nobody else could possibly understand this feeling. So, I was trying really hard just to convey that through my work. And part of what happened when I was younger is that I started to get really scared of eating food. So I was afraid that if I ate the wrong food, it would make me very ill. So I used to love going to salad bars and buffets, but suddenly I was like, ooh, this thing might have bacteria in it. Ooh, I don't know if I want to touch that spoon, because what if the wrong person touched that spoon before me? And it's just like it magnifies, it gets bigger, it spirals into something huge, and then I just wouldn't eat. And so my parents were worried about me. And that was about the time when my parents took me to therapy. So I was in 5th grade when I started going to see a therapist, and her name was Lauren, and she is a character in Guts. And this is one of the relationships that I had to, come to terms with. I was not into the idea of going to see a therapist because it seemed scary. It seemed like something I should be ashamed of. But was it? I don't think it was. This is also like the late 80s, and so I think the stigmas have changed just a little bit between then and now. And now I think more people do talk about anxiety and sometimes being in treatment for anxiety as well. So I'm glad to see that things have changed a little bit. But Lauren really helped me a lot. We talked about all sorts of stuff, about like the fact that I had a big family and had to share bedrooms with multiple people, and we only had one bathroom, and that was not good. And we talked about the fear itself and how I just had this sense that I was like falling through space and could not feel my feet underneath my body. And so one of the things we did was we learned about kind of grounding yourself and thinking about your feet on the floor, and then different breathing exercises. And it was really, really helpful. So, if my clicker would work. There we go. So eventually, I did admit to my friends what was going on, and it was usually in smaller groups, not like getting up in front of the whole class or 4,000 people in the, big main room at the National Book Festival and saying, I have anxiety, I'm afraid of throwing up, I see a therapist. I can do it now. 30 years does a lot for one's confidence, but once I actually started talking to my friends about it, it turned out that we were not all so different. Some of them were seeing therapists too. Some of them had things that they were anxious about too. So just being able to talk broke down those walls, and it was so helpful and powerful. So please, talk to people, be brave, it will probably help you. Finally, my third piece of advice is to share your story. And this is what I've sort of made a career of, is sharing my different stories with people. And by virtue of talking about these things, I've managed to feel less alone. So when I was a kid, I liked to draw. These are some of my masterpieces from when I was small. And the one on the left is from just before my 2nd birthday. I was a kid who liked to scribble. My parents gave me paper and crayons and markers, and I just made marks on paper because I enjoyed it. And I think a lot of kids enjoy it. And I'm a kid who never stopped. I still like making marks on paper. The one on the right is from closer to my 4th birthday, and you can tell that I was really looking and paying attention and trying to capture figures and humanoid characters with pizzas for faces, I guess. I don't know what that's about, but it's cool that my mom kept all of these drawings because it's very fun to look back over the whole course of my life and see my progression. These are some of the first comics that I ever made. So I started reading comics when I was about 9, and by the time I was 10, I couldn't stop drawing my own. And I would just look at what I had read. I would try and capture that same sense of energy, the types of, it's like a setup and then a punchline. You're creating characters, you're creating dialogue, and there was a lot to learn. For example, I don't know where the word balloons are and where the boxes are and stuff. I would just start drawing, and then I'd try to like fit the boxes around the drawing. It's easier to start with the box and then draw the pictures in the box. It's easier to write the words and then draw the word balloon around the words so that you make sure everything fits. And sometimes that helps you go, wait, this is way too many words. I need to cut a few words. So it's a process, but I think it's a process that you learn best by simply doing. So over the years, my comics have improved. And this is a comic that I drew when I was in college. It was a very short story called Beginning. And it's actually one of the mini comics that Warren was talking about earlier. I wrote this story for a class. It was 3 pages long. It was called Beginning. And it was actually about my experience of reading Barefoot Gen when I was 9 years old and how deeply that comic impacted me. And I feel like it has continued to impact me throughout my life. But I'm having a conversation here with my mom, where I say to my mom, I think that book ruined my life. And she says, I think it actually made your life better. You just haven't realized it yet. And I think she was totally right. A book that you read at any point in your life can change the course of your entire life for the better. This short comic has sort of taken me in a lot of places. It's part of why I met my editors at Scholastic. They read that mini comic. And they were like, we really like this short story. We'd like to work with you. And that was what led to me getting the Babysitters Club, which is a strange jump. Like, I made a comic about World War II. And they're like, okay, let's, do it at Martin's Babysitters Club. But there was a spirit there, and they saw it and they liked it. But it was republished in Japanese by somebody who translated it just for fun, because the book Barefoot Gen had been banned by a library in Japan. And this pedestrian just wanted to use my short comic as an example of why that book was important and why he thought that his kids and all kids should have a chance to read it. And I agree with him. And then it got republished in a couple of newspapers, and I can't read Japanese, but like seeing that is really cool. So you really never know. You really never know when sharing your story is going to connect you with others. Oh, and here's a picture of me when I was 11 years old, and I had this experience that I don't think any of you have heard about. I had an accident where I knocked out my 2 front permanent teeth and then had to spend the next 4.5 years of my life getting my face reconstructed. I should tell you the story sometime. Actually, wait, I already did that. I took that experience and weaved it into a graphic novel called Smile. And that was my first original graphic novel. It was published in 2010, and much like my short comics, I feel like this book has changed my entire life for the better. It's taken me all over the world. And before it was published, I had a couple of people say to me, no one's going to be interested in reading a comic about races. And no one's going to understand this comic that takes place in 1989. That's so weird. But what happens when people read the story is they see themselves. They can see their own pain. They can see their own insecurities and anxieties. A lot of them have braces. It turns out I've heard kids have braces. Like, it's crazy, but yeah, it's awesome. But it's been translated into like 25 languages at this point. So share your story. You never know. And then I kept doing it. So my second memoir is called Sisters, and it is the elevator pitches. It's about being on a road trip with your siblings. That's the whole story. But, a lot of us have been there before. A lot of us have siblings, or we have families. We've been on road trips, and we've got relationships with people that are so interesting that you can't help but want to tell their story. So that's what I've continued to do, and it's been really lovely to talk to people, and they're like, oh my gosh, I have a sister too! And that's it. I'm like, yeah, we're the same. It's really, and sometimes people are like, I've never had a sister, but now I know. So that's cool too. So I wrote a fiction book called Ghosts, and it was published 3 years ago. So I write both memoir and fiction, but a lot of times my fictional work has elements of my own life in it and aspects of my personality. So I am still reaching pretty deep inside in order to create my characters. And when I went on tour for this book, I talked a lot about how Kat, who's the older sister in this family, was anxious, and she was always worried about her little sister, and she was worried about life and about death. And so I would stand on stages like this one, and I would say, Kat and I have anxiety in common. And then I'd move on to the next subject, and people were like, wait, slow down, what? This is interesting, tell us what you mean. And so sometimes those are the signals that lead me to a project where I go, that is something that's maybe worth investigating, and maybe that is a story that I want to tell. So thank you, readers, for being curious about me and my life and about what I have in common with my characters. So yeah, that's just really about managing that and about examining it and trying to put it onto the page. And because I've been a cartoonist pretty much my whole life, over 30 years, I have had the benefit of being able to share my stories in a way that other people can read them and appreciate them and connect with them. And I feel extremely lucky to be able to do that. And that's not to say that if you're not a cartoonist, you don't have other ways of sharing your stories. You can write poetry, you can sing songs, you can make YouTube videos, you can do so many different things to express your point of view and your stories. But I encourage you to do that, because sharing your story means that other people feel less alone, and then the circle is complete. Oh, and I have another project that I'd like to tell you about, it turns out. It's called Share Your Smile. And that's an extension of the last slide, and it's hard when you don't have the slides in front of you, so you're not like, oh, the next thing I want to say is this. Hello. So Share Your Smile is actually sort of like a how-to and sort of an idea of the prompt builder. It asks a lot of questions, and I think that's one of the most helpful things that you can do if you're writing stories, is to ask yourself questions. Who are these characters? What are their families like? Where are they from? Where do they live? What do they like about the place that they live? What do they hate about the place they live? What do they like about their school? What do they like about their, car? There's so many questions that you can ask yourself. So this book asks a lot of questions, and then it's your job to fill in some of the answers, and then use those answers as jumping off points to tell your own story. And it's been so much fun to see kids filling the book in, or writing their own comics and showing them to me. I love seeing other people be creative. And now we get to talk about graphic novels, which is my favorite subject of all. So, graphic novels are real reading. I feel like this is, thank you. It's a funny conversation that we've been having over the last few years, where somebody sometimes will say, graphic novels are not real books. Just because you read them in an hour, just because they have pictures, just because they make you laugh, just because they make you, want to read the next book immediately in the series, it doesn't mean it's not a real book. That's totally what a real book is. And it's, they've got characters, they've got plots, they get people so excited, and it is so legitimate, and it's really lovely to be here, especially at a celebration of books and reading, and to be able to talk about graphic novels in the same space and on the same stage as some luminaries in the business. And graphic novels are a medium, but not a genre. This is a mistake that people sometimes make. They'll say, I love the genre of graphic novels. And I'm like, wait, that's like saying I like the genre of movies. Movies are a format. Movies are a medium for storytelling, and graphic novels are the same. So graphic novels come in many flavors. You can have Western, slice of life, history, science fiction, and sometimes people like to blend all of those things together. But a graphic novel is basically anything you want it to be, as long as there are both words and pictures.
On the right bottom.
Yes. I'm mostly...
Graphic novels still face a lot of stigma. This is from a comic strip called Art of the City by Mark Julie, who has a book out right now called Short and Skinny. And it was a week of strips where the mom kept pushing back and saying, a graphic novel is not a real book. I want you to check out a real book from the library. And what her daughter had to do was to make her read the graphic novel. And Mark, thanks Mark, they were talking about. And at the end of the week of strips, mom had been convinced. She was like, oh, this is actually a really good book. And her kid goes, graphic novel. So it's just important to spread this knowledge amongst the gatekeepers in your lives, be they librarians, teachers, parents, educators. We all need to sort of be together on this one, that graphic novels are amazing.
And only her books.
I think this slide got caught up, but it says you probably know that graphic novels are awesome. And I think everybody in this room could probably agree on that one, which makes me super happy. So one thing that's important to say is that graphic novels take a long time to make. And I think part of the problem is they can be read in like an hour, and people are like, okay, when's the next one coming out? And I'm like, it took me 3 years to make that.
Right. Wow.
And so please read it a second time, and maybe a third time. Some of you probably noticed today that I was not signing books today, and that's because my wrist is in the process of blowing out. And when I sign books, it actually takes a little bit away from the future of me being able to make more books. So I have to be extremely selective of when, where, and how many books I sign. And I'm about to embark on a 2.5-month book tour for Guts. So I just kind of have to pace myself. So I apologize for that, but I'm glad I got to take pictures with those of you that came.
Wow.
So that's me doing a stock signing of 4,500 books in Texas. And I had to tape up my arm like an Olympian. But comics can be as long or as short as you want them to be. So if you're somebody who wants to make comics, and you're intimidated by the fact that graphic novels take a long time to make a 1-page comic. Make a 2-page comic. Make a 10-page comic. It'll give you a chance to build your chops and to give yourself the experience of practicing. And then at some point, if you want to write a long-form graphic novel, you can. This is a single-page story that I did around the same time as I did the story beginnings for my mini comic. This one's about my first cup of tea. That's it. That's the whole comic. Nothing wrong with that. Graphic novels inspire budding creators. So one thing I've seen a lot of, and this is true for me as a kid too, when I read my first comics, I immediately wanted to make my own comics. So if you've got an inspired reader in your life, the next thing you know, they might be a writer, an illustrator. But all of us start out reading, and then some of us continue to want to be a part of words and pictures, and it's wonderful. Graphic novelist is an actual career, believe it or not. This is for you guys, Mom and Dad. It can happen. It takes a lot of work, and you spend a lot of time. I have actual assistants now who help me out in the studio. I still do all of my own artwork, but I have somebody who scans my pages, somebody who answers my email. They're super cool people, and most of them are also younger creators, and so it's nice to kind of mentor people and show them, you know, and pay them for the work they do, honestly, because they deserve that. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the actual career. This is my process talk, just because one of the things people ask me is like, well, how do you make a graphic novel? And it's so much easier to show than to tell. Again, that's the cartoonist thing. We're like, let me just show you, because the pictures are part of the story. So when I write, it is in a format called thumbnails. And that means that my ideas exist in my head, and when I put them on paper, they look just like this. They are already comics. They already have words and pictures and panels and word balloons, and I'm not spending that much time. I'm just kind of doodling little stick figure characters and then putting words in their mouths, and then I do this for the entire book. So I will do 250 pages of thumbnails, and then I basically have a blueprint for the whole thing. And I send those to my editor, and she is comic savvy, so she's able to look at this and see what I'm trying to go for. And then we edit my project from this stage. So I am often redrawing my thumbnails, but you know, each page only takes maybe 5 minutes. And what we're looking for at this stage is like, is the character relationship, are they all working? And how's the narrative arc feeling? And is there a part that could be expanded or shortened or clarified? So I'm doing all of the things that an editor-creator relationship would do at this stage, which is just making the book as good as it can be. But when that stage is finally done, like I said, the thumbnails do act as a blueprint, and so then I'm able to move on to final artwork. And I'm using a lot of the same tools, but I switch my paper up to something called Bristol board, which is just thicker, smoother, heavier, takes pencils and erasers a little bit better. So I'm actually going to go back one slide just to show you the difference between the thumbnails and the pencils. So it's the same information. It's pretty much the same thing. It's just that I'm spending more time when I'm doing the pencils as when I did my thumbnails. So, you know, it was comics all along. And so after the pencils are done, I move on to inking, and I'm using all analog tools here. I use a watercolor brush dipped into a bottle of waterproof India ink, going right over the same page. So I'm just tracing my pencil lines. And this is where I can add like darks and lights and do some cross-hatching and make it look as pretty as I want it to. And then I scan my work into a computer, and then it goes from being a piece of physical art to being digital art. And I open up my files in Photoshop, And then I'm able to make tiny corrections to my work. So instead of using like whiteout to cover up lines I'm not happy with, I'll just use Photoshop and use like my stylus or my mouse to do that. Oh, I just realized right here. Okay, I just realized that hi. Can you get me my badge?